In The Power and Politics of Dress in Africa, researcher Giselle Eris says that dress functions as a compelling political language, comparable in eloquence and potency to the words of the most skilled orator or the writings of the most persuasive propagandist. In Africa, dress provided a powerful arena for colonial relations to be enacted and challenged, and served as a method of cultural expression and resistance. This video is going to explore the history of fashion in Africa, how fashion was used as an expression of politics and identity, as well as how fashion served as both a means of control and rebellion. Africa is the second largest continent by both area and population, and incredibly diverse in both climate and culture, so most of the cases in this video will be from West and Southwest Africa. The pre-colonial era. In order to understand the fashion of Africa prior to European colonialism, one must understand the climate the people lived in. Generally speaking, the closer the culture was to the equator, the less clothing was generally worn. Most of the regions explored in this video are near the equator, and while they range from humid tropical rainforest to some of the driest deserts on the planet, they are all incredibly hot. Materials for clothing varied across cultures and regions depending on available resources, but there are a few common themes. Long woven fabric wraps were worn in several tropical and Sahelian regions in West Africa. In the Kingdom of Congo, cloth was made by men from the pounded fibers of certain tree barks. Commoners wore a simple cloth garment. Men and unmarried women wore one covering from waist to knee, and some women would wear two cloths to cover their upper body as well. Another common theme across pre-colonial African cultures is an acceptance of women being bare-breasted. Modesty, as thought of in Europe at the time, was non-existent, and this will become a point of religious and political tension a little bit later. Several African cultures, particularly those in drier regions such as Swazi and Herero of southern Africa, didn't have indigenous woven fabrics. In these cases, animal skins were sewn instead to make clothing, or skins and other goods would be traded with other groups for fabric. Like in Europe, traditional clothing in Africa was used to differentiate between socio-economic levels. In South Africa, clothing visually displayed the prestige of the chief and the lower status of the residents in his village, serving as a means of conveying and symbolically enforcing power. The power of clothing would be exploited during the colonial period in Africa to impose new structures of power across much of the continent. The colonial period. Colonizing powers would use clothing as a means to enforce their notions of morality upon the people they were colonizing in Africa. Missionaries from Europe banned traditional African clothing from being worn in church, deeming traditional attire unworthy for God. Traditional attire was also banned in schools, and bare-breasted women were banned from entering towns. This socially and legally reinforced notions of European superiority, and clothing visually represented this. African culture and liberation of the body was immediately struck down by colonizers who used Christianity to enforce modesty upon colonized areas where previously this word had no ideology and no meaning. Not only did this fashion imposition place Africans beneath Europeans morally, but it also degraded the power within African cultures. If traditional clothing were replaced with garments from Europe, these symbolic distinctions of power would disappear. In the late 17th century, Capuchin missionaries held a mass for the King of Congo, Pedro IV Nusama Mvemba. The king wore a tall woven crown called a mpu on his head, which displeased the missionaries. However, at this point in the kingdom's history, Christianity was quite widespread, and it was an established custom for the king to wear his mpu to mass. Upon refusing to remove the garment, one of the missionaries said of the king, quote, "If he does not take it off, he will be a heretic, a Jew, and not a Catholic Christian if he does not submit." But the Europeans did not eliminate identifiers of status from clothing. Instead, they imposed new identifiers that supported their desired power structure. In some instances, African men would be patronized and emasculated by being forced to wear European clothing associated with young boys or women. By banning or shaming traditional African clothing, colonial powers undermined and attempted to eliminate pre-existing displays of African culture and power, and allowed for the imposition of fashions that enforced power structures with the colonizers at the top. But these efforts were often met with resistance and rebellion. Several African cultures deliberately and outright rejected European clothing, or took and subverted the clothing of their colonizers to suit their needs. Linda Heywood's book, Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen, tells the history of Queen Njinga, who ruled the kingdom of Ndongo in modern-day Angola from 1624 to 1633, and fought Portuguese invasion and eventually signed a peace treaty with the Portuguese. 2 years before becoming queen, Njinga was sent on behalf of the king to meet with a Portuguese governor for negotiations in Luanda, a city in neighboring Portuguese Angola, and Njinga was determined to make a statement. While in Luanda, Njinga refused to wear Portuguese clothing. Instead, Njinga wore and highlighted the fashion of the Mbundu ethnic group which she was representing, and arrived with her arms and legs covered in priceless jewels, reflecting through dress Njinga's power and her kingdom's independence and strength as a nation to the Portuguese in negotiations. In other instances, European fashion and practices were appropriated and altered by Africans and given new meaning. Moving to the Congo at the turn of the 18th century, Christianity was widespread compared to other African neighbors at the time. Donna Beatrice Kimpavita is a Congolese woman who, after falling ill, claimed to be possessed by Saint Anthony. Donna Beatrice would go on to head the Antonian movement, which melded elements of Roman Catholicism and indigenous Congolese beliefs. The Antonian movement had both religious and political elements to it, and threatened both African kings and European clergy in Congo. Followers of the Antonian movement would tie ropes or threads around the hands and feet of Donna Beatrice, a practice similar to that of Portuguese Christians, both past and present, who tie gifts of money or messages to the statue of Saint Anthony. While similar in gesture, the Congolese had found their own meaning in the practice. Tying into both Catholic ideas, like being a bound slave to the Madonna, and the Congolese tradition of binding Christian objects to hold the power in those objects. The Antonians subverted the teachings and practices of missionaries and the church, simultaneously weakening the power of the church in the region, as well as empowering the Congolese people through a new movement that was native to them. Another instance of Africans appropriating European fashion and symbolism began in the late 1800s in what is now Namibia. Then known as German South Africa, after the region was colonized during the Scramble for Africa, German colonists ran into the native Herero and Nama people, who refused to be subjects of Germany. The Herero and Nama people were traditionally pastoralists, and cattle played a significant role both practically and spiritually for the Herero people. German forces began confiscating land and cattle from the Herero people, and the Herero began fighting back. The war would escalate to the Namibian Genocide from 1904 to 1908, where more than 80% of the Herero people and more than 50% of Nama people were killed by Germans. After this war, Namibia would remain under colonial control by Germany and then South Africa until 1990, when it finally achieved independence. So what does the Namibian Genocide have to do with fashion? Before colonization, the Herero wore animal skin, scant coverage by European standards, but the colonization and genocide would change this. With German colonization came German missionaries and German fashion, which was adopted and adapted by the Herero who lived under German rule until it became the Ohorokova, the traditional dress of Herero women to this day. The Ohorokova would share a silhouette with German dresses and consisted of a long skirt, petticoats, and a bodice with puffy sleeves, among other components, all elements derived from European clothing at the time. However, this did not mean that the Herero stopped expressing their unique cultural identity. Entire garment traits were not lost, but rather syncretized with what the Europeans tried to make absolute law. This can be seen in the bold colors and prints used to make the dresses. Also, a new headdress, the Ochikaiva, appeared, which resembles a cow's horns, paying respect to the Herero's cattle-rearing history and tying the Herero today to their ancestors who fought against the Germans. Herero men also adapted German dress, specifically German military dress. During the war, Herero men would steal German uniforms, a symbol of stealing the power of their enemies. One local Herero leader from Botswana explained, quote, "After the war with the Germans, the Herero wore the clothes of their bosses. The bosses, even non-military, were wearing uniforms. If you wear the clothes of your enemies, the spirit of the enemy is weakened. You are then wearing the spirit of his brothers, and then they are weakened. Hereros did do this. There is a sense of this in wearing the German uniform." Quote. To this day, military-style hats and dress can be seen in Herero traditional menswear, but this phenomenon of uniform parody is not exclusive to the Herero. In Swaziland, now Eswatini, and southern Africa, where indigenous peoples were forced to adopt the clothing of their colonizers, there was immediate resistance to the European attempt to colonize their style of dress. The fact that native Africans bought European attire meant in no way that it would be worn in accordance with the dictates of European fashion. For example, Southern Africans would wear a button-down shirt only, or trousers alone. Fashion across several African cultures served as a visual sign of resistance against colonial powers, and this resistance would persist and evolve into a renaissance and revitalization of African dress that can be seen today. The modern era. As African nations gained independence, there was a growth in cultural nationalism in some regions, where African culture and clothing was embraced politically. Swaziland was one such example, where in 1963, at the First Constitutional Conference in London, representatives for one of Swaziland's political parties appeared in Swazi uniform. Composed of brightly painted leather body ornaments and colorful printed fabric, the Swazi officials stood in sharp contrast to the dark suits the British considered appropriate for formal discussion. This decision to don traditional Swazi clothing in this international setting made a strong visual statement about the strength and resilience of Swazi culture against Western influence. This is not dissimilar from Njinga's choice to wear traditional clothing to meet with the Portuguese nearly 200 years earlier. Swazi dress would continue to be used as a tool to support the nation's independence, being worn during different political events around the globe. Furthermore, Swazi traditional dress would also become permissible school attire for students and teachers after colonial rule, reasserting cultural identity and challenging European notions that African clothing was inferior and unsuitable for these institutions. Fashion as a form of rebellion was not reserved only for European powers. La SAPE is an acronym which stands for Société des Ambianceurs et des Personnes Élégantes, or the Society of Ambience Makers and Elegant People. La SAPE is an avant-garde fashion movement that appeared in its modern form in the 1970s in the Congos. Originally, it was an attempt to mirror the styles of Paris, and its culture involved acquiring and wearing French designer clothing. But it gained a new meaning during the rule of Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 1970, President Mobutu outlined a national plan for Zairianisation, a political campaign for authenticity and distancing from European influence. Mobutu and his party adopted a garment known as the abacoste, from the French abat le costume, or down with the suit. La SAPE, with its clear French influence, acted as a form of rebellion against Mobutu's regime. Papa Wemba, a musical artist and advocate for La SAPE, believes that the movement constitutes a, quote, forme de rébellion anti-pauvreté et anti-déprime. La SAPE est aussi une façon de lutter contre la dictature de l'Abacoste, version locale de costume 3 pièces et uniforme quasi-officiel des hommes sous le régime de Mobutu. While there are Congolese who oppose La SAPE and see it as vain, superficial, and gaudy, Papa Wemba and other advocates for La SAPE see it as a way of protesting exclusion. One Kinshasa-based painter explained that, quote, everyone can SAPE, meaning that each individual has the ability to dress well and make their clothing their means of expression and revolt. Clothing provides the occasion for the subversion of established modes and the rejection of accepted norms. The attempt at controlling the individual through standardization of clothing, in the case of both colonial fashion and later the abacoste, was challenged by the adoption of alternative aesthetic codes, which itself is a symbolic gesture aimed at reclaiming power. In this case, despite the eccentric styling and penchant for designer labels, La SAPE emerged in the Congo not from the wealthy, but from unemployed youth in Brazzaville, all while claiming those symbols of wealth and power for themselves. As an aside, this very much reminds me of the modern fashion icon Dapper Dan, a black designer from Harlem, New York, who repurposed the logos of major European fashion houses that had overlooked black clientele for his own designs beginning in the 80s. Conclusion. Colonial domination is ultimately grounded in the face-to-face relations between the colonizer and the colonized, and dress was a tangible, visible symbol for this relationship. Throughout this video, there's been several examples of the use of clothing to define and enforce power structures, as well as how people subvert and rebel against political and social powers through clothing. From Njinga refusing to wear Portuguese clothing while negotiating for her people, European colonizers banning African dress in schools and towns, the German-inspired Herero Ohorokova, and Swazi representatives wearing their traditional dress to London and the United Nations. Fashion in Africa has been used as a tool for centuries by both Europeans and Africans to assert their power, value, and identities. Thank you for watching.